Hello and welcome. It's a privilege to be able to share this special time with you. Thank you for joining me as we walk through this final meal with Jesus and his disciples. Throughout this time together, there'll be moments where I invite you to pause and reflect on several questions that are available. If you are alone, please feel free to pause the recording and consider. If you're with a small group, pause and reflect together. I invite you that if you have any reflections or insights gained from this time, please feel free to reach out to me and let's talk some more. I invite you to get comfortable wherever you find yourself. And let's journey together as we enter this time of remembrance. Our story begins in Exodus, where the children of Israel are captive as slaves in Egypt, held as prisoners to the powerful nation thriving off the resources of the Nile River. The Israelites are the laborers whose bodies are broken and whose children are murdered to ensure the prosperity of Egypt. Israel is desperate for deliverance. Deliver us from bondage and oppression. And it is God who sees, God who hears, and God who answers their cries. Moses is hidden away, plucked from the Nile River and saved from death to grow into a God-appointed shepherd for the people. Plagues are sent to humble Egypt, culminating in this final plague, where the firstborn children of Egypt are struck down to spur Pharaoh to release his slaves. Exodus 12:21-28. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood of the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and he will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your homes and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give to you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of Israel in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.' Then the people bowed down and worshiped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. The blood of the Passover lamb guards the children of Israel, protecting the children whose lives were threatened since their first breath, but not this night. Imagine being an Israelite slave in Egypt. Describe your feelings or response to being in this situation and being an active participant in this moment of deliverance. This moment secures its place as a sacred event in the consciousness of Israel as they finally leave Egypt, freed from their captivity, a people seeking a land promised by God to their ancestors, a land of abundance. And it is with this scene in mind that we journey forward to the final days of Jesus' life on the earth. It is Passover in Jerusalem, and the descendants of these freed slaves gather in clusters throughout the city to share the Passover meal. The meal is preceded by two scenes of preparation. The first scene features the chief priest and Jesus' own disciple, Judas. Luke 22, 1-6. Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priest and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priest and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. And they were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. In the midst of preparation for this sacred Passover meal, celebrating deliverance from great oppression and suffering, those in power seek to destroy Jesus and silence the crowds that follow this teacher. This scene reminds us to be aware and cautious of our own hearts and motivations. There's no one that is immune to potential corruption. In a twisted turn of events, the religious leaders of a once enslaved people display characteristics that are more like Pharaoh than Moses. And Jesus' own friend and companion chooses to betray him. Judas traveled alongside Jesus, witnessed his miraculous healings, heard his teachings, and was loved by Jesus. How could he choose to participate in a murderous plot against his friend? We cannot know all the motivations that prompted the chief priest and Judas to get rid of Jesus. It's hard to know what exactly the text means when it states that Satan entered Judas's heart. But the concern remains that both parties, from an outside perspective, were entrenched in faith, but internally were drawn towards evil intentions and actions. Take a moment to pause and consider. What can we learn from the chief priest and from Judas? How can we guard our hearts against corruption? The second scene of preparation features Jesus' disciples, Peter and John. Luke 22, 7-13. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of that house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. In contrast to Judas's preparation, we find Peter and John obeying Jesus' words, entering the city, finding the upper room, and preparing the meal for Jesus and the other disciples. It's important to note that another layer of preparation lies beneath this scene. There's so much that awaits Peter and John. A willing host, a large room, the furnishings for the space. The evidence is clear that Peter and John share their teacher's intention and follow in step with his will. Judas is left searching for an opportunity to hand over Jesus to the chief priest. An opportunity is eventually laid in his path, but there's no sign of the abundant provision that we see displayed for Peter and John. Pause to consider. Can you describe a moment when you saw evidence that you were walking in step with God's will? With all preparations made, the disciples gather with Jesus for a final meal, the Last Supper, where the Passover lamb would be sacrificed. Judas is seated at the table with Jesus. Is he anxious? Is he sweating as he attempts to smile and laugh with his friends as though everything is normal? Of more concern, is Judas calm? His deception so pervasive that his conscience is not burdened by his decision? A table has been prepared for a feast where Jesus is seated with his friends, one of whom will hand Jesus over to face death, another who will curse and claim he never knew Jesus, and many more who will run in fear as Jesus suffers without them by his side. It is at this table where Jesus takes off his outer garment, lowers himself to the floor, and washes the feet of his friends who will abandon him, betray him, and deny him. John 13:1-15. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then Lord," Simon replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." And Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Even though the Father has put all things under his power, and Jesus is the host of this gathering, and the teacher and mentor of his disciples, he sets aside his role as a king, as host, as teacher, as an authority to be revered and honored in order to serve. To serve in the role of the lowest member of the household. The king becomes a slave. Jesus humbles himself to the point of washing feet, but not just any feet, the feet of friends and foes. Pause to consider. What strikes you most about this scene? Jesus tells his disciples to follow his example. How can we continue to serve in a manner that mirrors Jesus? Jesus returns to the table to share the meal with his disciples. Luke 22:14-20. When the hour came, Jesus and his disciples reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant of my blood, which is poured out for you. We can assume that the traditional foods required during the Passover meal occupied the table where Jesus reclined with his friends. But the only food mentioned is the bread, and the only drink noted is the fruit of the vine. During a feast, the meat prepared for the gathering was the most revered and special part of the menu. Especially at Passover, the lamb took center stage, as it was the slain lamb whose blood marked the people of Israel. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. The lamb is still present at the meal. The lamb whose body will be broken and whose blood will be poured out has prepared a table and is a host who offers all of himself to be consumed by those who sit at his table. What abundance! What abundance that Jesus does not choose to withhold from any assembled at this table. In the same manner that Moses told the Israelites in Egypt to remember God's protection and deliverance, Jesus tells the disciples to remember all that is about to transpire and all that he will freely give. Pause to consider, why do you remember that Jesus' body was broken and his blood poured out? Why are the participants in this meal significant? It is fitting that Jesus closes this meal with a promise of his own preparation. John 14:1-4. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I not have told you? I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I'll come back and I'll take you to be with me so that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. Jesus goes to prepare another table, a table that I pray is much like the table he already prepared for his friends, a table where the oppressed find deliverance, a table where slaves find freedom, a table where kings wash the feet of their servants, a table where enemies and traitors are now called friends, a table where there is abundance, where there's always enough, because Jesus is the Lamb and continues to give all of himself again and again. Jesus goes to prepare a place for us. In closing, pause to consider some final questions. Where do you find yourself in this entire narrative? How can we invite others to a seat at the table that Jesus is preparing even now? What is one point that you want to take with you from this final meal shared between Jesus and his disciples?